Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're heading south to Latin America.
South of the border.
Yeah, way south. To explore a world that's both fascinating and often really turbulent.
Hmm.
The world of civil-military relations. Now, you might be thinking military stuff sounds a bit intense, but
Right.
trust me, this is about way more than just tanks and troops.
Okay.
We're talking about the very heart of democracy in the region.
Absolutely.
That push and pull between civilian governments and these powerful armed forces.
Yeah, it's a delicate dance, and the steps can change dramatically depending on, the country,
Right.
the history. I mean, think about it. Latin America has seen it all. Coups, dictatorships, revolutions,
Yeah,
and these fragile democracies just struggling to find their footing.
right.
So understanding how civilian leaders and the military navigate their relationship is key
Yeah.
to understanding how these societies function.
Okay, so to guide us through this complex landscape, we've got a fantastic source.
Yes.
It's an article by Colonel Rhett, Jose Luis Esparza Guerrero,
It's a great source.
a Colombian military expert who's not just an academic, but he actually spent 33 years
Wow.
in the Colombian army, experiencing these dynamics firsthand.
That's what makes his perspective so valuable. He doesn't just theorize about civil-military relations.
Right.
He's lived them, witnessed the tensions, the triumphs, and the potential pitfalls, you know?
Right.
And he brings that insight to his analysis, connecting those real-world observations
Yeah.
to those broader theoretical frameworks.
Okay, so let's start with the theory. Esparza Guerrero walks us through 5 generations
Okay.
of thought on civil-military relations. So basically how scholars have grappled with this
Right.
question of like the ideal relationship between civilian governments and powerful militaries,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the context of a healthy democracy. It's like watching a debate unfold over time,
Yeah.
with each generation building on the ideas of those before them.
Exactly. You've got early thinkers like Samuel Huntington who really hammered home the importance of civilian control over the military. His famous line, "The soldier must be the servant of the statesman,"
Right.
really captures that essence perfectly.
Yeah.
Then you have folks like Morris Janowitz, who was like, hold on, it's not that simple. He argued that you can't just ignore
Right.
the social and political factors that shape this relationship. The military doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's
Yeah.
deeply intertwined with the fabric of society.
So it's not just about like who has the bigger guns. It's about societal values,
Yeah.
historical baggage,
Mm-hmm.
political climates, all that messy human stuff.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then you have scholars like Red Diamond, who focused on the specific challenges of democratic consolidation
Right.
in Latin America, especially in the aftermath of those military regimes.
Yeah.
Her work highlights how the specter of authoritarianism can linger long after the dictators are gone.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So how does Esparza Guerrero bridge this theoretical discussion with what's happening on the ground in Latin America? Because let's face it, the region has a pretty intense history when it comes to civil-military relations.
He uses a framework developed by Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian military theorist.
Okay.
It's called Clausewitz's Trinity, and it essentially breaks down civil-military relations
Okay.
into 3 key relationships: the military and the government and civil society, and the military and civil society.
Okay, a lot of moving parts there. So how does this trinity help us make sense of like the real world dynamics
Yeah.
in different Latin American countries?
Well, it provides a lens for examining the power dynamics within each of those relationships.
Right.
Think of it as a way to diagnose the health of a democracy by looking at how these 3 actors interact. Are they working in harmony? Are they clashing?
Right.
Or are they engaged in this constant negotiation?
Got it. So this trinity is like a diagnostic tool. Let's start with the first leg of this triangle,
Yeah.
military government relations.
Okay.
What are some of the warning signs Esparza Guerrero highlights, those potential red flags that suggest this relationship might be heading into dangerous territory?
One major issue is the blurring of roles between the military and the executive branch.
Okay.
He actually draws on his own experience here, talking about how during his time in the Colombian army,
Yeah.
there was an incident where a military unit was deployed to a region without clear orders or a defined objective. And this lack of clarity created confusion on the ground and ultimately undermined the mission.
So it's like who's really in charge here? And that ambiguity can lead to all sorts of problems, right?
Exactly. Esparza Guerrero argues that when those lines get blurry, it can lead to a situation where the military starts dictating policy or interfering in areas that should be the purview of civilian authorities, He points to Alvaro Uribe's presidency in Colombia
Okay.
as an example where this blurring of roles became a concern.
So like generals whispering in the president's ear about policy decisions that should really be made by elected officials.
Yeah.
That sounds like a recipe for undermining democratic norms.
That's the worry. And on the flip side, he also warns about the dangers of governments trying to impose their perspectives
Right.
on the military without taking into account military expertise. He uses the example of Chile's transition to democracy,
Yeah.
where the new civilian government, very eager to distance itself from the previous military regime,
Right.
implemented sweeping reforms without consulting or involving the armed forces.
So it's like a pendulum swing, right? You go from a military dictatorship to a civilian government that's so eager to assert control that they end up alienating the very institution they need to cooperate with.
Exactly. And Esparza Guerrero argues that this approach can backfire,
Yeah.
leading to resentment within the military and potentially undermining the long-term stability
Right.
of the democratic transition. He stresses that successful civil-military relations require a balance,
Yeah.
a recognition that both sides bring valuable perspectives and expertise to the table.
Okay, so it's about finding that sweet spot, that equilibrium where civilian control is maintained.
Right.
But military expertise is respected and utilized appropriately.
Yes.
What about the next side of the triangle? Government-civil society relations.
Okay.
How does that dynamic play into the overall picture?
This is where Esparza Guerrero really brings his Colombian perspective to bear. He talks about how Colombia's long history of internal conflict
Right.
with guerrilla groups, paramilitaries, and drug trafficking organizations all vying for power
Yeah.
has shaped the way civil society views both the government and the military.
So it's like a society that's been traumatized by violence and instability, and that trauma can make it hard to build trust and establish those healthy relationships
Right.
between citizens, their government, and the armed forces.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes that in such context, it's even more crucial
Yeah.
for civil society to have a deep understanding of how democracies work, especially in countries with a history of authoritarianism.
Because if you've only ever known a system where the military calls the shots,
Right.
or where political participation is suppressed, it can be hard to suddenly shift to a democratic mindset. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argues that citizens need to know their rights, understand how to engage in political processes, and hold their leaders accountable. Without that foundation, it's difficult to build a truly participatory democracy.
So knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating these complex political landscapes. But it's not just about individual citizens understanding their roles, right?
Right.
There also needs to be a productive dialogue between the government and civil society on security issues.
That's crucial. Esparza Guerrero argues that when it comes to issues like crime, terrorism, or drug trafficking, you can't just have the government dictating solutions from on high.
Yeah.
You need to involve civil society in the conversation, listen to their concerns, and work together to find solutions
Right.
that are both effective and respect human rights.
Because let's be honest, those top-down approaches often backfire, right? They can alienate communities, create resentment, and even fuel further instability.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with a more collaborative approach,
Right.
where the government and civil society see each other as partners, not adversaries,
Yeah.
working together to address these shared challenges.
Okay, so we've got the military and the government and civil society. What about that final connection? Military-civil society relations.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways there?
This is perhaps the most fraught relationship of the three,
Okay.
especially in countries with a history of conflict or human rights abuses perpetrated by the military.
Right.
Esparza Guerrero argues that mutual distrust and negative stereotypes are often major roadblocks in this area.
Okay.
He points to his own country, Colombia, as an example.
Yeah.
Despite significant progress in recent years, there are still regions where the military is viewed with suspicion, especially in communities that have borne the brunt of the armed conflict.
So it's like those past wounds can take a long time to heal,
Right.
and they can poison the well for any attempts to build trust and cooperation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he also talks about how the Cold War, with its focus on combating communism, often led to a blurring of lines between internal and external threats in many Latin American countries.
Right.
This created a climate where anyone perceived as leftist, subversive, or critical of the government could be labeled an internal enemy.
Yeah.
justifying all sorts of abuses by the military.
It's like a paranoia that's seeped into the very fabric of society, making it difficult to distinguish between legitimate security threats and political dissent.
That's a key point. And Esparza Guerrero argues that this legacy continues to affect how some elements within the military view civil society, creating a barrier to building those essential relationships of trust and understanding.
So unpacking that historical baggage, addressing those past injustices, and acknowledging the harm that was done is crucial to moving forward.
Absolutely.
But what about more recent events? We've seen a wave of leftist governments coming to power across Latin America.
Right.
How are they navigating these complex civil-military dynamics?
That's a great question, and it's actually the focus of the next part of Esparza Guerrero's analysis.
Okay.
He dedicates a whole section to examining how these new leftist governments are approaching their relationships with the armed forces. And it's a fascinating mix of approaches, challenges, and opportunities.
Sounds like we're about to get into the nitty-gritty of modern-day Latin American politics.
We are.
Listener, if you're as intrigued as I am, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into these contemporary case studies.
Yes.
And see how these leftist leaders are walking that tightrope between maintaining civilian control and forging productive partnerships with their militaries. All right, so we're back and ready to really dive into the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
How are these new leftist governments in Latin America approaching their relationships with the armed forces? I'm picturing this high-stakes balancing act, trying to maintain democratic principles while also, addressing security concerns.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a delicate dance, and each country is trying to find its own rhythm, its own way of navigating this complex terrain. Yeah. What's fascinating is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
Esparza Guerrero provides a sort of cheat sheet in his article.
Okay.
It's a table summarizing the approaches of different countries.
Oh, I love a good visual aid. So who are the players on this political dance floor?
We've got Colombia, Mexico, Brazil,
Okay.
Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Guatemala.
Wow. That's quite a few.
It's a real mix of political context and historical baggage when it comes to their relationships with the armed forces.
Let's start with Colombia. Given Esparza Guerrero's background, I imagine he has some strong insights into how things are unfolding there.
Absolutely. He acknowledges that there was initial distrust between Gustavo Petro, Colombia's first leftist president, and the military.
Yeah.
Remember, Petro himself was a former guerrilla fighter.
Wow, talk about a historical turnaround. From fighting against the military to leading them, that's got to create some interesting dynamics.
It certainly does. But Esparza Guerrero notes that despite this initial tension, there have been some positive developments.
Okay.
Petro has emphasized human rights and sought to improve the living conditions of rank-and-file soldiers.
So focusing on the well-being of the troops, that's a smart move.
Yeah.
Happy soldiers are less likely to be tempted by those whispers of discontent, right?
It's certainly a factor. He's also trying to shift the military's focus away from solely fighting internal conflicts and towards tackling broader security challenges, like environmental crime and transnational organized crime.
So adapting to the changing security landscape and recognizing that the old playbooks might not be relevant anymore. What about Mexico? They've got this long and complicated history with the military, especially when it comes to the drug war and allegations of human rights abuses.
Esparza Guerrero describes Andrés Manuel López Obrador's approach, or AMLO as he's known, as pragmatic. He's given the military a prominent role in both security and development projects, really leaning on their logistical capabilities and organizational skills.
So building bridges, giving them a seat at the table, but potentially also raising concerns about blurring those lines between civilian and military authority.
Exactly.
It's that classic dilemma we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Some critics worry that AMLO is relying too heavily on the military, potentially undermining democratic institutions in the long run.
Right.
It's a debate that's playing out across the region, this question of how much is too much when it comes to military involvement in civilian affairs.
Okay, let's move on to Brazil. Lula da Silva, who recently returned to power after a tumultuous period, has been pretty vocal about his views on the military right.
He has. Lula is a fascinating case because he comes from a leftist labor union background.
Right.
But during his previous presidencies, he actually had a fairly good relationship with the armed forces. Now, after the Bolsonaro years, which saw a much closer alignment between the military and the far-right government, Lula is focused on reasserting civilian control, and depoliticizing the armed forces.
So kind of a course correction, bringing the military back into its lane, so to speak. How's that going down? I imagine there might be some resistance from within the ranks.
There's always that possibility, especially given how deeply involved the military became in the Bolsonaro administration.
Yeah.
But Lula's a savvy politician, and he's trying to strike a balance. He's pushing for greater professionalism within the military.
Okay.
A renewed emphasis on national defense rather than internal security.
Right.
And he's also trying to address the economic concerns of military families.
It's like he's saying, look, I respect your role, I value your service, but let's make sure we're all clear on who's calling the shots here.
Right.
It's a delicate dance.
It is.
Yeah.
And then you have Chile,
Yeah.
a country that went through a brutal dictatorship
Right.
and is now led by Gabriel Boric, a young leftist president who's trying to modernize the military
Okay.
while also upholding human rights.
That sounds like a tall order, trying to reform an institution that's been so closely associated with repression in the past. What's Boric's strategy?
Well, he's focused on adapting the military to new challenges like climate change,
Okay.
cyber threats, and disaster response, while also emphasizing transparency and accountability.
Okay.
He's trying to create a military that's more in tune
Yeah.
with the values of modern Chilean society.
So shifting the mindset, updating the mission, and trying to build a new kind of relationship based on trust and respect.
Yeah,
That's a long-term project, that's for sure.
it is.
What about Bolivia? They have a history of political instability
Right.
and military involvement in politics.
Right. And Esparza Guerrero highlights how current President Luis Arce has maintained
Okay.
a close relationship with the military, viewing them as key to stability. It makes sense given Bolivia's tumultuous past, but it also raises concerns
Yeah.
about potential over-reliance on the military and the risks of politicization.
It's like that saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
Right.
You need those checks and balances, that separation of powers,
Right.
to prevent any one institution from becoming too dominant.
Exactly. And finally, we have Guatemala, a country that's still grappling with a legacy of a brutal civil war,
Right.
in which the military played a central role. Bernardo Arevalo, the new president, is trying to reform the security sector and strengthen civilian control.
Okay.
But he faces an uphill battle given the deep-seated power structures and the resistance from those who benefit from the status quo.
It's a reminder that changing these entrenched systems takes time,
Yeah,
persistence, and a lot of political will.
absolutely.
So we've got a real spectrum of approaches here, from pragmatic partnerships to attempts at reform and modernization. What's Esparza Guerrero's overall assessment? Is he optimistic about the direction things are heading?
He's cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
He acknowledges the challenges, the potential pitfalls,
Yeah.
but he also sees a genuine opportunity for positive change. He argues that these leftist governments,
Okay.
with their focus on social justice and democratic principles,
Right.
are well-positioned to reshape civil-military relations in a way that benefits both the armed forces and society as a whole.
But he's not painting a rosy picture, right? He's
Right.
not saying that just because these governments are leftists,
No, not at all.
they've somehow cracked the code on civil-military relations.
He's very clear-eyed about the risks.
Okay.
He points out that there's always the danger of leftist governments becoming overly reliant on the military,
Right.
using them to achieve political goals or silence dissent. He even uses examples from other parts of the world to illustrate how leftist regimes
Right.
can sometimes end up becoming just as authoritarian and repressive
Yeah.
as their right-wing counterparts.
It's like that George Orwell quote, all animals are equal,
Yeah,
but some animals are more equal than others.
right.
Ideology doesn't automatically guarantee good governance.
Exactly. And Esparza Guerrero stresses that vigilance is key.
Okay.
He argues that civil society, the media, and independent institutions
Yeah.
all need to play a role in holding these governments accountable,
Right.
ensuring that the military remains subservient to civilian authority.
So it's about checks and balances, transparency,
Yeah.
and a constant push for accountability.
Absolutely.
And that brings us back to Esparza Guerrero himself. You mentioned earlier that he reflects on his own journey in this article, going from military officer to scholar, advocating for better civil-military relations.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. He talks about how his own education on civil-military relations was quite limited during his time in the Colombian Army.
Okay.
The focus was primarily on tactical and operational training, with very little emphasis on the theoretical or historical aspects
Yeah.
of the relationship between the military and society.
So he had to learn a lot of this stuff on his own.
Right.
Through experience and observation. Almost like a self-guided deep dive into the complexities of this relationship.
Exactly. And he credits his 33 years of service,
Right.
during which he held positions at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels,
Yeah.
with giving him a unique perspective on the complexities of civil-military dynamics.
Right.
He saw firsthand how those theoretical concepts play out in the real world, how decisions made in the halls of power can have a ripple effect on the ground,
Yeah.
impacting the lives of soldiers and civilians alike.
It's like that saying, you can't learn to swim by reading a book.
Right.
Sometimes you have to jump in the deep end and experience it for yourself.
Absolutely. And his experience clearly shaped his thinking.
Yeah.
He writes about how he witnessed firsthand the challenges of balancing security needs
Right.
with democratic principles, the importance of building trust between the military and civil society, and the dangers of politicization.
It makes you wonder if his experience with Operation Jacques, that daring rescue of 15 hostages from the FARC, influenced his thinking on civil-military relations.
Right.
That had to be a situation where trust and communication were paramount.
I'm sure it did. And it's a reminder that while we often focus on the tensions and challenges, there are also examples of successful collaboration between the military and civilian authorities.
Okay, so listener, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive into Esparza Guerrero's work? Why should you, sitting there wherever you are, care about civil-military relations in Latin America?
First, this is about much more than just military strategy.
Right.
It's about the very foundations of democracy and how power is balanced in society. When these relationships are healthy, it creates stability, security, and the space for citizens to participate in their own governance.
But when those relationships are dysfunctional, you risk ending up with either a weak state, unable to provide security, or a military that wields too much influence and undermines democratic processes. And Latin America's history is full of examples of both scenarios.
Right, exactly. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for anyone interested in Latin American politics, economics, or social development.
Because, let's face it, the military is a major player in many of these countries.
Right.
And how they interact with the rest of society has a huge impact on everyone's lives.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating about this particular moment in Latin America is that with so many leftist governments in power, there's a real opportunity to redefine these relationships and chart a new course.
And Esparza Guerrero's analysis provides a valuable roadmap for navigating those complexities, drawing on both theory and real-world experience.
Yes, and he reminds us that there are no easy answers or one-size-fits-all solutions. It's an ongoing process that requires constant dialogue, adaptation, and a willingness to learn from both successes and failures.
Absolutely.
So, listener, we've given you a lot to chew on today.
We have.
Now, here's a final thought to ponder as you go about your day.
Okay.
Esparza Guerrero focuses on Latin America. But how do you think these same dynamics play out in other parts of the world? Are the challenges and opportunities universal, or are there unique regional factors at play?
It's a question worth exploring. We encourage you to continue learning, thinking critically, and forming your own informed opinions on this crucial topic.
Right.
After all, the health of democracy depends on it.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep exploring.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to think about how these dynamics play out in different parts of the world. You're right, Esparza Guerrero's focus is Latin America, but his work raises these questions that resonate far beyond the region. Absolutely. He provides a framework for understanding these complex relationships.
Right.
And those frameworks can be applied to other contexts, other political systems, other historical moments.
It's like he's giving us a set of lenses to examine these dynamics wherever they occur, helping us to see those patterns, those recurring tensions, those like universal challenges.
Precisely. For example, take a place like the United States, a country with a strong tradition of civilian control over the military.
Right.
You might assume those concerns about blurred lines of politicization wouldn't really apply there.
Right.
But that's not entirely true.
Right, because even in well-established democracies, those tensions can emerge.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, like, the debates around military spending, the use of force overseas,
Mhm.
or even the influence of retired military leaders in politics.
Exactly. Those are all examples of how civil-military relations are never truly settled.
Right.
They're constantly being negotiated, renegotiated, and contested.
Yeah.
And it's not just about formal structures or legal frameworks.
Right.
It's also about societal norms, cultural values, and the shifting balance of power between different actors.
So it's this ongoing dance, this constant interplay
Yeah.
between civilian and military authority, and it's happening everywhere.
Right.
Even in places where you might assume those roles are clearly defined.
It is. And I think that's one of the key insights Esparza Guerrero offers.
Okay.
He reminds us that these relationships are dynamic, fluid,
You're right.
and always evolving.
Yeah.
They're shaped by political events, social movements, economic crises, technological advancements, and even global trends.
It's like trying to hold water in your hands.
Yeah.
It's constantly shifting, adapting, taking on new forms.
Yeah.
You can't just capture it in a static model or a set of fixed rules.
Right.
You need to be constantly observing, analyzing, and questioning those assumptions.
Exactly. And that's why this kind of critical thinking,
Yeah.
this willingness to engage with complex issues is so crucial. It's not just for academics or policymakers. It's for all of us.
Because at the end of the day, civil-military relations impact all of our lives.
Right.
They shape the way our societies function, the way our governments operate,
Yeah.
and ultimately the kind of world we live in.
Well said. And that's why Esparza Guerrero's work is so valuable.
Right.
He's not just providing answers, he's prompting us to ask better questions,
Yeah.
to delve deeper, to challenge those easy assumptions.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to keep those questions in mind.
Yeah.
What has this exploration sparked for you? What other perspectives might you seek out? How can you apply these insights to your own understanding of the world?
Remember, the quest for knowledge is never ending.
Right?
The more informed we are, the more engaged we are. The better equipped we are to navigate these complex challenges
Yeah.
and contribute to a more democratic, just, and secure world.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes. Thank you.
And keep exploring.